Dr. Joshua Blank, Research Director at the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin. Thank you so much, and welcome back to Eye on Politics.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. So we are now seeing the field of candidates in the U.S. Senate race here in Texas grow. We've already had two Republicans. Now we have two Democrats with the entry of Colin Allred and Terry Virts, and three other Democrats may get into the race. And I'm wondering, do you think that this is a case, at least for the Democrats, that they're treating this as an open seat because they believe Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, will beat John Cornyn, the incumbent, in the GOP primary? They believe that Paxton is vulnerable, and also the anger that they have against President Trump.
I mean, look, I think even before we get to the particulars of who is going to be the Republican nominee for U.S. Senate, I think there are a lot of Democrats looking at 2026 in the same way that a lot of Democrats were looking at 2018. They see a president in the White House who clearly unifies and mobilizes their party and gives them something to rally around before the campaign even starts. They expect to have a good fundraising environment. And ultimately, they know that, presidents' parties tend to do poorly in their midterm elections, and this is a particularly active president. So, regardless of who the Republican nominee may or may not be, I think there are a lot of Democratic candidates who are interested both in the Senate race, but also in some of the other races on the Texas ballot because the election dynamics are probably going to be more competitive for them even before we get to who the Republicans nominate.
So let's stay on the Senate race for a second. How likely do you think it is that former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, current Congressman Joaquin Castro of San Antonio, and State Representative James Tallarico of Austin get into this race? And how will they gauge whether they should, do you think?
Well, how likely? It's tough to say. I mean, I think the thing that Allred has done is certainly changed the calculus for those candidates. I mean, one of the things that he's done here is that he's made a calculated decision to announce his intentions early. He did this, in his last race for U.S. Senate, but in many ways, by doing this, one of the potential consequences is to clear the field of at least some of those candidates. He's already talking to funders of the campaign who funded his last Senate campaign. He's already talking to volunteers. He's already talking to consultants. And because it hasn't been that long since he shut his campaign down, it's not really going to take that long for him to start his campaign up. And whereas for a candidate who would be less well known, it might be costly to potentially, essentially stick your head up above the hedge so early. In Allred's case, it doesn't really matter. Voters already have been introduced to them. It's not as though whoever the Republican nominee turns out to be is going to spend a bunch of time trying to define Colin Allred in a different or further way than they've already tried to do during the last election cycle. And so for Allred, there's not really a lot of cost here. And there's a lot to be gained if a couple of those candidates might look at that raise and say, this guy raised close to $95 million last time. He already has volunteers in all the districts. Maybe I should look at one of the other races. I think that's Allred's intention here.
And how important is it, though, despite the fundraising, despite the fact that he really just came off of being in campaign mode, is grassroots support? And do you think that these other candidates are going to be looking at the response from the grassroots when it comes to their decision making?
Well, I think this is always what candidates are looking at when they're thinking about primary elections. I mean, this is also what's going on the Republican side. Ultimately, Ken Paxton sees an opportunity against John Cornyn because he feels like he's the stronger candidate amongst the more conservative voters who are likely to dominate the Republican primary electorate. That same question is going to be asked about whether there are weaknesses or holes in Colin Allred's support amongst the Democratic electorate that can be exploited by one of these other candidates. Having said that, given how long Democrats have been in the wilderness here in Texas and given the difficulty they've had actually in filling a ticket from top to bottom, and also just add one more given, even though I don't want to, and given the number of candidates you've even mentioned right here as possibilities, I think there's going to be a lot of conversations going on in sort of elite Democratic circles about whether they can't distribute these candidates a little better across the ballot.
And, I was talking to the first candidate, main candidate who got in, this retired NASA astronaut and colonel from a U.S. Air Force fighter pilot, Terry Virts. And when I spoke with him, he said that he doesn't think Allred can win. If you go back historically and you see anybody who ran for U.S. Senate and lost is not going to win the next time. What do you make of that?
I don't actually think that that's historically accurate, whether in Texas or actually in a number of states. And really, the criticism that I think a lot of people have levied at Democrats as a party in Texas and at candidates in particular for really a number of years now is the fact that candidates don't run multiple times. Part of the issue here has been the fact that someone like Allred normally would essentially run once for statewide office and then go off into his law practice or something else. And with that, all the experience that he gained running the first time, all and again, that goes beyond just the experience, essentially being a campaigner, which is important, but also the lists he's built, the infrastructure he has, the knowledge he has from running one time that he can apply to the next race. And really, the criticism has actually been the Democrats aren't running often enough in some ways, that there's too much reticence among people like the Castros, maybe amongst less so Beto O'Rourke, but amongst maybe a Wendy Davis to essentially, you know, just run again. And so I understand the criticism, and it certainly is a problem having lost to then say, but this time you should vote for me. But I think people would acknowledge the fact that the context in 2026 is going to be very, very different than the context in 2024.
Yes. And let me ask you, because one of the main themes, at least that I got out of the campaign video that Allred put out there, was he is running on an anti-corruption theme this time. And this is something that you polled in your recent poll. And corruption, political corruption and leadership was the number one problem that Texans felt. Overall, it was 17% higher than inflation and prices, higher than immigration, higher than border security. And among Democrats, it was the highest as well, 31%. So I'm wondering, what exactly does political corruption mean? I mean, because it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to try to oversimplify this too much, but I think what it means to, in this case, really is Donald Trump. And I'm not sitting here passing a value judgment, but when you look at those numbers, it's really being driven by Democrats. And Democrats, both when we ask them what's the most important problem facing the country, and what's the most important problem facing the state, in the University of Texas Politics Project polling that we do regularly, normally Democrats are split across a range of issues, with no issue really, I would say, jumping up above any other, but usually 6 or 7 issues, each at about, 5 to 10%, climate change, gun control, education, abortion policy, and so on and so forth. With Donald Trump entering office, what you see is the Democrats have essentially all been focused on Donald Trump. And one of the things that I think, is sort of maybe underappreciated here is that even though we've just had a Texas legislative session in which Texas government has been front and center, the president inserted himself into that session repeatedly. He endorsed both the lieutenant governor and the speaker of the House during the sessions for their next election. He got involved in the voucher debate. He's called for the legislature to come back and redistrict. And so ultimately, the closeness with which Texas Republican officials are, cultivating with the president for their own voters is actually turning off a lot of Democratic voters here in the state. And again, there's really nothing that unifies Democratic voters like Donald Trump. And that's what you're seeing in those numbers right now. And it's something that I think, Democratic candidates, including, obviously here, former Congressman Allred, are looking to capitalize on.
And you expect if the other candidates get in, they'll be talking about this as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think, we're hearing, rumblings about which other candidates might jump into some other races. And I think you should expect a lot of that to be focused on leadership in the state and whether or not the leadership is focused more on, Donald Trump's agenda probably, or the state's agenda. And that's something I think Democrats, will probably happily unify around up and down the ballot.
And you brought it up before, and that was as far as these candidates, will the Democrats, split up and, maybe somebody will challenge Governor Abbott. We haven't heard of anybody, any main Democrat targeting Governor Abbott's race. Have you heard of anybody, and who do you think we might be seeing do that?
I haven't heard any, particular names yet. I think the names that we've been hearing floating around and some of the people who've announced, I think, Representative Goodwin has made clear her intention to challenge the lieutenant governor. There's rumblings that State Senator Johnson from the Dallas area might be challenging for the Attorney General nomination. Again, that'll be an open seat,
Yep.
um, and a freebie for him, that
Yes.
he's not up for reelection, so he can do that. But I mean, I think, part of this goes back to what I was saying about Allred. Because Allred ran so recently, he's known there's not much cost to him, essentially, again, making himself the target right now, because in general, the Republicans are mostly focused on each other. That's not the case with Abbott. Abbott likely is not going to face any sort of serious primary challenge. And for a Democrat who might have less name ID in the electorate to essentially say, I'm running against this governor who, by the way, happens to have an almost unlimited amount of money to spend against me the entire summer, might be better to wait. And so I think that the candidates are, making different strategic calculations at this point.
Right, because the filing period doesn't start until Saturday, November 8th.
That's right.
So
And it doesn't close until December 8th.
that's correct.
And I think, one of the things that we forget is, if we've been following elections here in Texas for a while now, which I certainly have, most of the time at this point in the cycle, the Democrats are lamenting whether or not any candidate at all is going to be running for statewide office, let alone where these candidates might just be distributed, or even if someone has announced too early. So this is a different environment. And I think it's worth kind of recognizing that in the long term, that again, it's much more common for the Democrats to be scrambling to find somebody to fill out the ticket come November. Uh, this time, I think, we're really more interested in sort of figuring out where these, again, candidates are going to distribute themselves.
And I think this brings up a point where earlier in the year, after President Trump took office, and for various months, Democrats were really on unsure footing. They had a big loss, obviously, in November, and they weren't really sure how to fight back against President Trump and his policies. And now it seems to be changed where they are getting a footing and they are trying to tap into that anger by Democratic voters and some independents, where they are bringing forward now that now they seem to be more excited about running against him.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll say this, the interest and intention of candidates is one thing, the electorate is another. And while Democratic voters are really focused on, I think, the president at this point, and in particular sort of political leadership at all levels of government, especially when they're Republicans, they're not excited about the Democratic Party right now. And the Democratic Party is really devoid of leadership. And I think that's also why there's so much maybe discussion and interest in people running for these positions in some ways, is because it really is a free for all. I mean, you mentioned earlier this idea of, essentially who might get into the race and the role of activists in the party. And I think ultimately, right now we're in a broader, political universe where a lot of the assumptions are kind of being shaken up a little bit, right? I mean, Donald Trump has really detach the Republican Party, from sort of what we think of as traditional conservatism in a lot of places. It doesn't mean he's not, achieving conservative goals or addressing what people think of as conservative problems, but he's doing it in a way that is not traditionally conservative or Republican in some instances. And ultimately, this is putting Democrats in these positions of trying out new things as well. And you're seeing this all across the country with Democrats sort of appearing on these conservative or conservative leaning podcasts and talk shows and trying to figure out different ways to talk about issues. And I think you're seeing that in Texas too. I mean, ultimately, what the Democratic Party stands for in Texas in 2026 is an open question, but how these candidates sort themselves out and start, messaging and coordinating their messaging amongst themselves, is going to be a big part of the answer of what that looks like going forward.
And, to your point at the beginning of our interview, when you said that this very well may be something like 2018, do you think, at least in the Senate race, or maybe any of these statewide races, there needs to be a 2018 version of Beto O'Rourke, who is, many compared to this genie out of a bottle?
Maybe. I mean, look, it certainly helps. I mean, I think anytime a political talent can come along with no baggage and the ability to raise tens of millions of dollars and earn media seemingly at the drop of the hat, that's an advantage. I mean, I watch a lot of sports, and it doesn't matter what the sport is. It doesn't matter, fill in the blank. Be like, well, wouldn't it be great to add like a clutch goal scorer or point? It's like, yeah, everybody wants that on every team. So yeah, I think to some extent something like that would be helpful for Democrats. At the same time, I think the dynamic and the environment is so different. We just have to wait and see. I think there's a lot of opportunities here for Democrats to make the map more competitive than it has been. At the same time, the Democratic Party is sitting at an all-time low, and they really need to dig themselves out of it. But in some ways, it may feel a little bit crazy at times. This is what the system is supposed to do. We have a big shift right now in the way that the government is operating, and it's the job of elections to either validate that approach or brush it back. And that's how this system works. And you see the Democrats trying to essentially figure out how to become the the vessel of that message. Again, I'll just say this. This is a pretty different environment for Democrats than what we've seen in the sense that I think there are Democrats who want to run for office. There are multiple Democrats who probably want to run for statewide office. We're probably going to hear more announcements sooner than later, and that's pretty unusual. Um, and so I think, Democrats should be buoyed by that. I don't necessarily think Republicans should be scared, but the fact that Republicans are more focused on themselves, is certainly some cause, for concern, and why I think there's been so much talk about the Republican side of the ticket so far.
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about the Democrats, and I wanted to ask you, at least in the Republican primary for U.S. Senate between Paxton and Cornyn, a lot has been made, of course, of these early polls that Paxton is quite ahead of Cornyn. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, what is Cornyn going to have to do? Because, I've talked to other analysts who say Cornyn's going to really have to widen this primary field, get other people, other Republicans in there, not just the strong grassroots, but widen that to try to knock off Paxton. But isn't he going to have to really maybe go personal? I mean, we've already seen that to try to really raise Paxton's negatives.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of almost identified, two of the three ways. Well, just the three ways in which, Cornyn's going to make this a little bit better terrain for him. One, he's going to, moderate the Republican primary electorate by expanding it. That's going to be a tough ask, but it's something that, they're going to try to do. The other thing that can happen is that, Paxton's support can be cut into with another strong sort of far right candidate, and there's certainly likely to be more out there who are interested. The question is how much resources they have to really challenge Paxton for some of those, let's just call them, less than enthused or even anti-Cornyn votes in the Republican primary. So that's another thing that could happen. And the third, as you said, is he can go negative on Paxton. The thing that I would say here is that you know, Paxton has a lot of liabilities here. There are a lot of Republicans in this state, Republican House members who voted to impeach the Attorney General. There's a lot of information about that impeachment. And while some people would say that has already been litigated in the public, I think it's very clear that it has not been litigated in the Republican primary electorate. While that case was going on, there were allies of Paxton spending lots of money in order to shape Republican and conservative attitudes around the impeachment. There was no such counter effort to say, here's what Ken Paxton did. You should think about this differently. John Cornyn has all of the resources possible to make that case. And I think it's already indicated there's going to be no limit in the amount of spending they will do to make that case to the Republican primary electorate. And so this is going to be litigated really for the first time in the Republican primary electorate in the way that it hasn't, because there wasn't someone prosecuting the case against Ken Paxton in the way that John Cornyn is going to attempt to do it. And we'll see what that does to the polling and whether that hurts Paxton or not.
And my last question to you is, we just saw the results of the Democratic primary in New York City for mayor, where a Democratic socialist, Zohran Mamdani, has won. And I'm wondering, are Republicans, even as far away here in Texas, going to try to tie that man? I mean, we'll see what happens in the New York City general election, but are they going to try to tie him to any Democrat running here in Texas?
This is no offense. It's like a predictable question, but I guess my response will be, regardless of whether this candidate, won the Democratic nomination in New York or not, I think every Democratic candidate who runs in Texas risks being called a socialist, a communist for any number of reasons, and it makes no difference. I mean, there's not been one election that we've had in the last, 8 or 10 years in which the Democratic candidates at the top of the ticket aren't tied to socialism, tied to communism, tied to some sort of left-wing extremism. And so, I mean, in some ways, it's kind of part of the political rhetoric. I think, really Democrats, have to worry more about that race in New York probably than they do about it here in Texas.
All right, we will leave it there. Joshua Blank from the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin. Thank you so much, as always. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.